Hi, everybody. This is Susan Clinton, one of your hosts from Tough to Treat. I am really excited to bring you this episode today, 198. It's about some underlying causes of lumbopelvic pain that can arise after previous injuries. Why is this important? Have a listen to the episode and see what conclusions you can draw for evaluation and interventions that might be novel to what you've already been thinking about. In preparation for combined sections meeting for the physical therapists out there, join Erica and I on Thursday, February the 15th at 11 a.m. If you're on site, come say hi to us and come and listen to our presentation. We look forward to hearing back from you on any kinds of thoughts you have about our podcast. We also ask that you leave us a review so that others can find us. And finally, if you have a client that you're struggling with or would like to present a difficult case, please email us at toughtotreatpt@gmail.com. Thank you so much and enjoy the podcast. Okay, so one of the things that we want to do is why do we care about all of that? Well, I just want to make a little bit of a clinical connection for you with what Earl Pettman calls the psoas pyramid. And basically, we want to just kind of think about a few things. It's neurological innervations. The psoas is T12 through L1, okay, and L2. And the iliolumbar ligament, the psoas, the hypogastric, genitofemoral, femoral nerve superior, and the cluneals all also come from the same region. So we have a lot of information that comes out of, and guess what this is? Why did we go there first? Thoracolumbar. So this is an important area, but it has a lot to do with what happens with the lumbar spine, because the psoas is going to be controlled more by the upper part near the thoracolumbar junction than it is down lower, like L3, L4, L5. Not going to have as much of an influence into the psoas as the upper part is. Okay, so the control of movement is lumbar side bending to the same side, and then rotation is contralateral, just like the upper cervical. Side bend one way, rotate the other, okay? So the right psoas is going to side bend the trunk to the right, and it's going to contralaterally rotate the trunk to the left. It also supports hip flexion and external rotation in open chain, okay? And therefore, it can become a pelvic posterior rotator by helping the hip go into flexion. We go into posterior pelvic rotation. As a trunk muscle, it's a side bender and contralateral rotator. As a hip muscle, it's flexion external rotation, and it's extension internal rotation eccentrically. So here's the thing. We need to think about synovial joints, of which the hip is one, the femoral acetabular joint. And one of the ways that synovial joints get their nutrition is through close packing. And when we lose this piece of hip joint mobility, we have a lot of problems, because the hip can start to break down. The femoral acetabular joint can start to break down. It's got to move into extension and internal rotation to achieve closed packing. The best way that it can do this is walking, but it's not going to get there if we don't have lumbar extension, rotation. Well, let's say lumbar side bending, okay? So if we don't have lumbar extension and side bending, that's going to foul this up. And if we don't have thoracolumbar rotation, we're not going to have this. So it doesn't matter how good of a side bender we are. If we don't rotate up here, it's game over. So that's why I don't go to the lumbar spine first. I go to the thorax. Thoracolumbar rotation, mid-thoracic, get it going, get in the CV joint and see if you need to do anything there. And then you can either go up to the cervical or you can come down and deal with the lumbar spine at this point. But trust me, if you get this other stuff cleared up, this stuff starts to get better. And then you can kind of start looking at the hip and going, why isn't the hip extending? Well, because we weren't getting great lumbar extension. The lumbar was like getting stiff. And so when we have a stiff lumbar spine, we're not going to move into hip extension with walking. We're just not. So this is what this is just talking about. So I just kind of told you there in a nutshell what's happening here. But one of the things that this guy Grekovetsky was able to do was he discussed what was called the spinal engine right here. You'll see that word there. And basically what he said was that the psoas is strong enough to make people walk in even if they don't have legs, because it's the side bending rotational piece that the psoas can give that helps the trunk move in the directions it needs to move for walking. So the trunk can side bend and rotate and lift and come over and lift and come over and lift and come over. That's all psoas action, of course, accompanied by quadratus and some of the other supporting characters, but that's what the psoas does. And he felt like it was the one that when you're walking, one of the things that happens is that we go into hip extension, okay, and we have an associated decreased rotation, and we get eccentric lengthening at the end range, right? So when we go into hip extension and hip internal rotation, we're getting an eccentric lengthening of the psoas group. And that is going to give us stored mechanical energy, okay, to pop us into hip flexion, side bending, and contralateral rotation on the opposite side. So in other words, we need to load to explode. And walking is controlled falling. So the most important thing that happens in walking is the hip extension internal rotation, along with the trunk movement, to lengthen that psoas as much as possible, so that the minute our toes come off of the ground, we pop into a forward swing, and then our heel hits and the hamstrings slow us down. Okay, so it's controlled falling when we walk. It's very efficient, but it only works if we've got good hip extension. And the only way we get good hip extension is if we've got good lumbar extension. And the only way we get good lumbar extension and side bending is if the thoracolumbar junction rotates. Okay, if we lose rotation at the thoracolumbar junction, it doesn't matter how awesome the hip is, it will not rotate. It won't rotate into internal and external rotation. And that's a big problem for a lot of people as we run down the road, because the body will adapt until it can't. So even people with total hip replacements, or people with, you know, those kinds of things, even total knee replacements, I spent a lot of time, you know, with them with the thoracolumbar rotation and really restoring that rotation from the top so that they don't run into anything below when they're really starting to get some of that back. So this is just another thing that I just said. And so what happens is that if we get stiffness in the hip, you know, we don't go into the full thing, that we in the spine and the lumbar spine is stiff, we can start getting some SI joint breakdown. This generally is one of the things that occurs in people over long periods of time under compression. And so they start having SI pain as they start hitting into their later years. And it's just because this joint has become very sensitive and it's being ground on all the time because we're not moving adequately through the hip and the lumbar spine. And once again, back up and get the rotation working. Also, if the psoas is too long, then it can't generate mechanical stored energy. So if it's overstretched, a requirement for efficient gait, and sometimes you'll see that in the presence of femoral acetabular impingement or an anterior glide of the femoral head, okay, of the femur. You know, because it's shifted forward. And so these are people who like lean on their long ligaments. They lean in standing, they're on the back of their heels, you know, that kind of posture. We talked about quad strategy, upper abdominal strategy, you know, sometimes maybe post-pregnancy, you know, so the psoas can actually be long, not short. People always complain that it needs to be stretched there, and that's not the issue. Most of the time when I see people like that, it's like the things are too long in front. We need to like get them into a different recruitment pattern so that they can start recruiting their posterior chain and stop recruiting their anterior chain too much. So, so we may have an over rotation of the spine at this point, an arm swing to kind of like pull us through. And they use the quadratus early, and so they have a lot of hip hiking and things that go on too. They're going to have a long abdomen and a long, the hips are going to be, it's going to be long in front. They're going to lose their abdominal spring, their anterior spring. And so we want to definitely help people get that back. But that's a lot of people who stand, and a lot of like, way back here all the time. Okay. So one of the things you can think about, which also I see down the road in a lot of people, because people will come to me and they'll say that, have you ever had any back pain? Oh yeah. And in fact, I had a ruptured disc, or I had a disc problem, and I had the pain down my leg and blah, 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 blah. And all of these kinds of things, and so how did you treat it? Well, we did extension exercises. We did this, it finally went away. Well, the nociceptive input went away because things healed, because the body heals, but the patterns stay there. Remember, we talked a lot about this weekend. The patterns stay. They don't run away until some spotlight is shined on new sensations and new emotions are attached to say, we don't need to be here anymore. We need to start doing something different. Otherwise, if everything's okay and we've adapted, the body moves on. But maybe we run into a situation where there's been a series of adaptations, and this is one of them. And we want to help kind of create some different movement. So when you have a posterior lateral nerve root impingement, you need to think about the mechanism behind the lateral shift. And we've talked about this already. So the psoas, so if I have a nerve root on the right, my psoas on the left is going to fire. And it's going to take me into left side bending. Okay, because we don't want to be compressing over a disc lesion. There's disc breakdown, there's in-plate bleeding, there's micro in-plate fractures. It's not comfortable at all. It hurts like crazy. So the psoas will work to relieve the compression in this area. So we'll side bend to the left, and we'll have a little contralateral rotation to the right. Okay, it gets us off the nerve root. But the head, remember I talked about this just a little while ago, the head has to maintain a neutral gaze along the horizon. So we actually, instead of staying side bent and rotated and walking around crazy, we just shift our thorax over to the left. And so our eyes can get back on the horizon. And that is what a lateral shift looks like. And I see lateral shifts in people all the time, years down the road. Okay. Another pattern that can develop in the lumbar spine is we can have a kind of a hypermobile spine. There's some people who move really well. They have a lot of mobility, and some people will say they actually have a lot of mobility, maybe too much mobility. So these people who have, kind of are hypermobile tend to get into trouble when they're extended all the time, because that puts a lot of compression at the facet joints. And when we have a lot of compression there, they can get sensitive. And that's what happens is we get maybe we get a little breakdown with them. Maybe we get a little neural sensitivity. And then we get this kind of thing where it's like my back went out and I can't move. And it's like, their back didn't really go out, but they've got a pattern in there that's saying don't move. And so now they're like super stiff. But what we see over time with these people is that they prefer to be in flexed postures. These are the people that are going to sit in the chair and bring their knees up. They're going to sit on the floor and they're going to curl their knees up into their chest. They feel better in flexion, and they like flexion a lot better. The psoases are both tending to be a little bit on the overactive side. Why? Because they're trying to give some core stability to the area. I don't ever use the word stabilization with my patients, but the psoas doesn't know what to do. And the brain doesn't know what to do, so it says, do something. So it says, okay, well, all right, psoas, let's do this. We'll get together and we'll both pull. But instead of creating flexion, which is what's going to be created through the abdominal wall, because the psoas is not in a position to be a great flexor. It's a side bender and a rotator, not a flexor. And you get a lot of compression with the overactivity of the psoas. So stretching this, and it's not going to give you nociceptive or tightness in front of the hips either. It's going to give you more trunk stuff. And stretching this isn't going to make it better, because it's an over-recruiting muscle. So it needs input to stop over-recruiting, if that makes sense. So they're going to also, and so they don't have great coordination of their trunk. They're just like, everything's kind of all over the place. So they have a history of what they call locking and catching, but those are just basically, that's neural patterning, right? Because we can't go in and do the clinical prediction rule and do like a little gapping manip on the back, and all of a sudden they're well. Darn well there's no such thing as a locked joint. But a joint can be held very tight by the neuromuscular patterning that's coming down from the thalamus and the midbrain, with reference and into from the trigeminal system and the sympathetic system, right? Now we know how all of that works. We can see how that patterning works. And so when these people tend to age, they may have a little bit more degeneration and stiffness that happens in some of those sites. So they could be somebody who was a very hypermobile person, like had hypermobility syndrome, younger in life, and now they've got stiffness, because it just happens, the body, and it's not because the joints degenerated because they were moving too much, it's because they were being held too long. Remember, stiffness is neurological in the beginning. It just is. And then over time, the muscles shorten. If they're being told to hold on for dear life and they do that for 30 years, there's going to be shortening and we're going to have compression, and it's going to be harder to move that joint. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's nociception there. Okay. So how do we do this? How do we mobilize? How do we exercise? And how do we maybe do a little bit of psoas specific stuff? So the things that we want to consider here is with the mobilization is that, you can get the people to lay down on their side in the bathing suit pose, and they can work on, the hip coming forward and the trunk going backwards. And that basically sets them up in kind of a gapping for the lumbar spine, which is really nice. It's easy for them to do. They can rotate they can rotate up to the pain, they can rotate to the edge of the pain, wherever it is that you think they need to go. If you want to come in and do the mobilization with them, you just walk right up to them, put your belly right against theirs, and you can actually help them by doing the mobilization a little bit. You can guide them. But like I say, if I do an imposed mobilization on somebody, I always start them activating it before I let go with my hands. And then when I'm done, they're still doing it so that they know that this is something they do and not something I do. And they're getting the novel input to their system to make the change. So exercise is also important. And I think everybody knows great exercises for the back. If you've got somebody who has a stiff segment, you want to not just do flexion extension. Those are important motions for the lumbar spine for sure. So things like cat-cow and all kinds of different positions are great, but you also want to think about side bending. And then you want to think about combinations of exercises going to take them into side bending and flexion and side bending and extension. And you're just going to have to kind of keep going with those until you can kind of get them more comfortable and moving. If you try, this is my conformational bias, totally my conformational bias, but if I try to do too much in the lumbar spine before I go and help them get their thorax moving better, I find it much harder for them to create change. So I have found that if I can go to the thorax and get some things happening there, that oftentimes the lumbar spine becomes easier to move because it doesn't have to balance that stiff thorax all the time. It essentially helps take the lumbar spine out of compression. Because when we can get the thorax moving and we get the breathing going and we start getting the system changes all the way through, like we were talking about, that can happen, then it's easier to move the lumbar spine out of compression too, because it's just going to come on up as soon as we start lengthening and growing tall and coming out of compression. The lumbar spine is going to be just drugged straight up with it. So those are all really good considerations. Deep squats, bendovers are all lumbopelvic interventions. And those were the reasons we chose those in the beginning too, was like rotation. Well, that's not really the lumbar spine, but it is the hips and it is the thoracolumbar. So that's important. But then as we got further up into the thorax, we started noticing that we could bend over easier and we could squat easier. And the reason is because we're freeing up the lumbar spine and it's able to extend better. Is that lengthen? Sorry, lengthen better. Okay. So that is that on the lumbar spine. So now everybody has that piece too. And so if you wanted to like work on the psoas muscles, like if you wanted to lengthen them or you wanted to shorten them, you can do one and then the other. So if you think about the psoas, it's got a tight psoas on the right, you know, like they had a left neurological event that sent pain down their leg and they ended up with a right lateral shift, and they still have it. And I'm thinking, I bet that right psoas is tight to beat the band, because, you know, it's been holding this position for a long time. I'll introduce some rotation. Yeah, that made it a little better. We'll do a little bit of this. That made it a little bit better. You know, doggone it, I think we need to get in and really kind of maybe start talking to the muscle a little bit more. Well, I'm not going to stretch the right side. I'm going to fire up the left side, because neurologically, if I get the left side to work a little bit more, it may crosstalk over to the right and say, hey, dude, let go. I'm working over here. So you do a left rotation, right? And then you do a opposite, left side bending. I said rotation first. Left side bending and a right rotation. So now you fired up the left side to work, but you essentially take them into a position where the right psoas has to lengthen. But you're using neurological stuff to do, and it makes it, you know, it's just easier than it is trying to like get in your position and lay over here and stretch over and do all that kind of crazy stuff. It's just get the other side working and bring the other side down. If you think they're tight on both sides, like they're compressed and they really like that flexion posture and that kind of stuff, work one side then the other. But do the rotation stuff first. Do it first, do it first, do it first, because the neurological overlay coming out of the T-spine can have a great deal of influence on the psoas muscles, because T12, L1, L2. And that's why we do that first. And the other thing is that it's really important to do that thoracolumbar rotation when you're considering the lumbopelvic region, because remember the ilioinguinal dermatomal stuff is all, L1 is all across the groin. So that's a differential for you for groin pain, is what happens if I get more rotation in the thoracolumbar area? Does that start changing their subjective experience in the groin of their hip?